Hello and welcome to Dishelved with Adam White. Today I'm going to continue my talk on my world's finest project. This week I'm going to talk about Batman in the Golden Age. This is actually volume 4, but the first 3 volumes I have, uh, they were released as trade paperbacks and put on Kindle. So I've got them on Kindle because I got them really cheap when they were on sale. So I've got the first 3 volumes of the Omnibus editions actually on my Kindle. So, but I wanted something to show you, so I got this one out. The Batman ones are a little hard to get. I've got 4 and 5 and 8 out of 9, so I'm missing 3 or 4 of them. But they're like, if you want to spend $500 on eBay, you can get them, but that's not something I'm interested in doing. So, anyway, I want to talk a little bit about the golden age of Batman. Uh, when it started out in Detective 27, for the first few issues, maybe 10 issues or so, Batman was a dark character. He had a more distinctive kind of floppy eared look that came from Bob Kane, and Bill Finger was the writer. And I know Bob Kane always tried to take sole responsibility for the creation of Batman, but Bill Finger was there from the beginning too, so he definitely had a hand in it. The first issue of Detective that Batman was in was completely stolen from The Shadow. The plot was, and so it started out as kind of a rip off of The Shadow, but he had a distinct look for the Batman, and in those early issues, the first few issues, you do get his origin and how the bat came through the window and gave him the idea to become the Batman, and how his parents were killed. So I mean, you do get that Batman origin. It's short, but it's a lot more of an origin than Superman got uh, in his golden age first appearances. Uh, the early stuff of Batman, like I said, he was a darker, pulpier character. He had a machine gun on his bat plane. Uh, for Mr. Doesn't Use Guns, that was a strange item to have and use on criminals in their cars and stuff. Um, and he would like, this one crook leaned out the window and Batman swung by and kicked him in the head so hard he broke his neck. And he pushed another guy down the stairs later and broke his neck in another story. And just, he would shove people off cliffs. And it was really dark. And he didn't have a problem with killing like he did later, the Batman we all know from today. And he didn't have an aversion to guns either. So he was more of a pulp hero earlier on. And then they introduced Robin. And when Robin was introduced, the stories got much lighter. And Robin really made it more of a uh, appealing to kids. And Batman got a little less pulpy, and there was a little more kind of a happy vibe to the comic instead of the darker vibe of the earlier issues. Uh, However, in earlier issues, they still had some of the pulp appeal because they'd be like on a, a skyscraper being built, just fighting on the beams of the empty skyscraper, and Robin would swing around and kick a guy off to his death. And they just went on like that was just an okay thing to do. And they're like, well, they're criminals. They earned what they got. So I mean, there was still some dark stuff in it. But yeah, like I said, even Robin kicked people off skyscrapers to their deaths. So it was really strange. Another later uh, issue after they kind of quit doing that. They kept making big deals about how they didn't use guns, and uh, you'd never take the life of a criminal. They still ended up running some off cliffs in cars, and uh, one time Robin was fighting this guy with a gun, and Robin forced the gun back to the guy's head, and the guy ended up blowing his own head off. So there was still some dark stuff in these comics, but they were also made with kids in mind, because sometimes at the end of an issue, they would break the fourth wall and talk directly to the reader, and the reader was obviously meant to be kids, and they'd be like, see, crime doesn't pay and you shouldn't look up to gangsters. And because that was a thing that went on back in those early days, in the in the late 30s, early 40s, as kids would look up to criminals because they always had money and fame, and they'd always be like, crime doesn't pay, kids. And so there was an element of that too. But overall, the stories they got kind of repetitive in that first volume. And so, I mean, I liked them, but it was just Batman versus, people doing a protection racket. And then the next time he'd be against bank robbers, and then there'd be another protection racket. And it just kind of got, like I said, a little repetitive. And it just was him fighting regular criminals. And some of them were there was a few that were a little boring, I'll admit. But it was still fun and really interesting to see what a different character he was, especially in those early few issues. Now, something else to talk about is there's always been a debate as to how much Bob Kane was involved as the artist. And like I said, in those early issues of Detective, uh, Batman had floppier ears and a kind of a darker look to him. And especially after Robin got introduced, they were brought in as uh, so-called assistants to the artist, Sheldon Moldoff and Jerry Robinson and George Russos. And if you look at their art later in their careers, when they're getting to do art under their own names, you'll notice that the stories in Batman look a lot more like their art than they do Bob Kane. So there's it's a real question to me as to how much Bob Kane was actually involved. Now, his name showed up at the end of every issue, and sometimes at the beginning too. And Bob Kane seemed to take full credit for it and never let Bill Finger get credit as a writer, even though he was the writer of these. And like I said, these Jerry Robinson and George Russos and Sheldon Moldoff, their art was more prevalent in the stories, I thought, as it went along. Batman got a more classic Batman look to him. Uh, they had, uh, they just had more of a look of those artists than they did Bob Kane. Now, where the early issues really shone was the issues with the Joker. Joker was introduced in Batman #1, and I really liked the art on the Joker. Overall, the art wasn't as good as the art was in Superman. Superman had better art than the early Batman did. All the regular people just looked kind of unfinished, like they were doing a rush job, which they very well could have been because that's the way comics were made back in the day. They just did stuff really fast. But overall, I didn't like the art in it as well as I did in Superman Golden Age. But the Joker issues were fantastic. The Joker was pretty much the Joker you know today. Right from the beginning, he used his Joker gas on people where they ended up with the smiles on their dead faces. And he had a lot of locked room mysteries where he'd, send a notice out in the newspaper as to what he was going to do and what he was going to steal from who. And then he'd do it and they wouldn't be able to figure out how. And he just was very smart, a very smart character and a very vicious character. And I really like the way they drew the Joker. He was always given a lot of stuff. Now he was taken from a Shadow story too. I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head. I meant to reread that before I did this video, and I simply forgot. But he was kind of, Jerry Robinson talked about in an issue of the Shadow, uh, in an issue of the reprints, about how they got the idea for the Joker from the Shadow, just like they got the idea of Batman from the Shadow. So, but Joker was definitely his own character, and he showed up probably 7 or 8 times throughout the first volume of the first omnibus, and everything with him was great. Every time they fought him, it ended up looking like he'd been killed. And they're like, oh, well, I wonder if he's really dead this time. So they didn't have a problem with killing him, apparently. But he always managed to survive and come back. Despite the fact that many of the times the things that happened to him, a normal person would have been dead, definitely. But Joker always managed to come back. And there was one issue that featured the Scarecrow, the first appearance of the Scarecrow. It was a World's Best or something like that. It was, or it might have been a World's Finest. I can't remember what the title was of the issue, but it was Jonathan Crane. He did not have his fear gas. He just used elements of fear by dressing up like a scarecrow and basically doing a kind of a protection racket. But the look of the scarecrow was really strange and really moody, and I really liked the way the scarecrow looked. So they always did a good job with the supervillain types, and it was I really liked that one issue with the scarecrow, and really liked the way that he looked in it. They did also have the cat, or the Catwoman. She had no costume except one time she wore a cat head, which looked really odd. But she was never given a name, but I assume it was the Selena Kyle character because later on she did get a costume, and Batman always let her go in the few times she appeared because I think he had kind of a crush on her and she on him. So that was apparent right from her first appearance. But he always managed to let her get away for some reason, and Robin couldn't understand it. But so overall, really interesting to read the first, the first issues of Batman. I liked the pulpier character better than the kind of carefree character that he became when Robin came along, which, like I said, wasn't that long after he was introduced. But they wanted to make it more appealing, I guess, to kids than to adult readers because, uh, that's why they introduced a kid Robin. But like I said, he was always in the middle of fights, and I mean, he was probably 14 or 15 years old, and like I said, kicking people off of skyscrapers. So it was really strange to see that, but overall, it was really interesting to see the beginnings of Batman. And like I said, the issues with the Joker and the Scarecrow were phenomenal. And there were some other standout ones too, just of, fighting regular criminals. Dr. Hugo Strange made a few appearances too. He was a villain later on in Batman, so he managed to survive uh, in later issues as a character, as a villain. Uh, they had kind of a different take on him in those later issues in Batman, but uh, anyway, really good stuff. Fun to see how Batman started. I'm eager to read more, and but I'll leave you with that this week. I hope that you enjoyed this little talk on Batman and Superman, my continuing World's Finest project. And thank you for hanging out with me this week, and I will see you next week.